Well, so thanks so much. I think I've been given like a half an hour or 40 minutes, but I really don't want to talk straight for that long. So please shoot me questions in the chat or raise your hand or whatever, and let's make this at least somewhat of a conversation around these issues. So what I want to talk about today is something I like to call the myth of nonprofit ineffectiveness. And really what I'm hoping for everybody to get out of this by the end is two things. One is to understand or to believe that most nonprofits are in fact highly effective, and two, to have some understanding of how we can demonstrate the effectiveness of nonprofits. So let me get started by saying a little bit about my day job. I am on company time right now, so I have to at least share a little bit about what I do, and it happens to be, I think, very interesting. So I recently joined a company called Spiral. We're a socially responsible bank. And so our goal is really to bring what I've been working on the last few years of kind of moving money towards highly impactful charities, trying to bring that to a much larger audience of retail givers and potential retail givers. And so to do that, we offer not just a checking and savings account, but we actually offer what we're calling a giving account, and we match donations up to $150 a year and so forth. So in addition to that, we have a really great program for nonprofits. It's free. And so if you are a nonprofit or work for a nonprofit, which I think most people on this call probably fit into one of those buckets, check us out. Okay, that's the pitch. All right. So this is the motivating question that I started with, which is a very simple question on its face, and I actually think a fairly simple question to answer, although we certainly at Impact Matters and then Charity Navigator spent a lot of time trying to answer it. And this basic question is just, are nonprofits doing a good job? I think we all have some sense of what nonprofits should be doing. We all have some sense of what nonprofits are doing. So the question is, are they doing a good job at what they should be doing? And kind of going into this talk, I want to start with two hypotheses. The first is that most nonprofits are in fact highly effective. This is what we found at Impact Matters, and I'll be going through this data towards the end. But this is what I want to sort of prove to people on this call, that the reality is, if you look at the data, what you'll see is that most nonprofits, at least where we've been able to understand whether they're effective, most of them indeed are highly effective. And the second point I'm going to get to at the end, and we'll see how it goes. It's going to be a little bit of a live exercise, but I want to prove that that actually proving a nonprofit is effective is often very easy. Not always. There are many times when it's very difficult, but there are also many times when it's easy. And I think it's a good kind of tool to have in one's tool belt as a nonprofit professional. So returning to this question, how can we prove most nonprofits are highly effective? We got to start with where we are today, and I think this is something that is not going to be controversial with folks on this call. But today there's this widespread belief in the United States that nonprofits are not achieving their missions. And we can see this both in terms of our intuitive sense of what we understand about the country, and those we talk to and those we work with. And I think all of us on this call have probably heard some version of these, usually from people in our lives who are not involved in the social sector, the nonprofit sector. Nonprofits aren't effective. They waste money on CEO salaries. They have good intentions, but they don't make much of a difference. And then, of course, the doozy, the for-profit world is so much more efficient and effective than the nonprofit world. So that's our intuition. And the question is our intuition that this myth exists, is that actually backed up by the evidence? And the answer is pretty much yes. If we look at survey evidence out there about how people view nonprofits, generally speaking, consumers are fairly untrusting of most organizations out there. But that certainly extends to nonprofits as well. So we see this, the give.org does, the BBB Wise Giving Alliance does a great survey on specifically on this question of donor trust. And they find that, about half of people say, 1 to 6 on a trust rating, and only about a fifth of people are saying, 9 and 10. Now, in the net promoter world of consumer net promoter scores, what you care about really is the 9 and 10. Those are people who are really excited about the concept that you're asking them, and clearly that's a very small percentage here. And then of course we see the same quotes here, and we see of course people very focused on this question of overhead. So based on our intuition, based on the evidence, it does seem like there's this myth out there in the country that nonprofits are ineffective. So one way that we could characterize this, and the way that most sort of donors talk about this, is in terms of waste. And really, if you look at the language, I mean, I'll go back a few slides. If you look at this language, a lot of it has to do with waste. It has to do with wasting CEO salaries, wasting money on CEO salaries, or really just wasting the donation that the donor is giving. We could get into some, I think, interesting side tangents about the psychology of why waste is so in the foreground for donors. But leaving that aside, the question is there a lot of waste in the sector? And pretty much the answer is no. So a couple of years ago, my co-founder with Impact Matters, Dean, and I did this analysis. We looked at 990s across, I think, something like 100,000 990s. We looked at overhead ratios, and a very small percentage of nonprofits, about 2.5%, have overhead ratios above 50%. And you go to like above 60%, and it drops even further. So it's a very small percentage of nonprofits that are even in the zone of high overhead. Now, overhead is a bad metric, and blah blah blah. So that settlement, that argument's been fought and won. We don't need to necessarily go into that. But the point is, if that is what you're looking at, the data shows that there isn't a lot of waste. Another way to look at this is Charity Navigator advisories. So Charity Navigator, one of the great services that it provides is it basically collates all of the information out there about legal actions against nonprofits. So anytime an attorney general has sued a nonprofit, or anybody sued a nonprofit, any sort of regulatory action, anything like that, they have a great system for catching that and putting it together. It's probably not 100% complete, but it's about as complete as anything that we have out there. And the crazy thing is there's only 400 nonprofits in the entire country who have possible legal issues at the moment. Only 400 out of 1.5 million. We're a country of like 360 million people. We have 1.5 to 1.8 million nonprofits operating here. Maybe 300,000 or 400,000 of those are really operating. Regardless of the denominator, the numerator is tiny. It's only about 400 groups that have any legal issues, and some of these are not even substantiated. They're just open regulatory actions that haven't concluded. So I think we can pretty clearly say that the waste myth is just that. It's a myth. There's really nothing of substance that we can point to here. You look at CEO salaries, CEOs in the nonprofit sector are paid substantially less than their counterparts in the for-profit sector operating similar organizations. So we know all this. This is not really in question. But the question then comes, like, why do we focus on waste in the first part? We know that there might be some psychology for why donors focus on waste. But when it comes to the sort of the sector itself and how we look at our own work, is waste the thing to focus on? And I think most people would agree, no. The thing to focus on is really mission impact. We could talk about whether there are other things to add to this list in addition to mission impact. I am a bit of an impact purist, so I will argue that most things that we could add to this list are just a form of impact, defined in a different way. But mission impact really seems to be the critical piece. And to give one more point about the waste, I mean, there's this great quote that, who knows who actually said it, that half my advertising spend is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. Even if there is waste, even if there is, there is some, no doubt about it. The point of the matter, the fact of the matter is that the nonprofit sector is doing extremely important work for the country, for the people in the country, for the world, and the existence of some waste is not enough to is not really good justification for withholding donations or anything of the sort. So, turning to the question of mission impact, at Impact Matters, we came up with a very specific definition of what impact is. It's pretty verbose, but every word is there for a reason. So basically says the positive change in mission-driven outcomes that are attributable to a program relative to the resources expended by that program. So to break that down, if we start with mission-driven outcomes, this is really, what we care about. So it could be life saved, it could be income increased, and so on. One thing we were very clear about at Impact Matters is that this was up to the not up to us to define, right? Like ideally, it should be up to the constituent to define. Often it's up to the funder to define. That's a kind of an interesting side conversation. But the question is, the point is that really there are a lot of different valid missions out there, a lot of different valid mission outcomes out there. But a critical point that we tried to reinforce again and again is that an outcome is only, in our opinion, very useful is if it can trickle down to the level of a person or an animal. A lot of times we see discussions of kind of broad systems change and policy change and so forth, and those can be an incredibly important way of changing lives, but we have to connect it down to the life. It's not good enough to just say, we passed a good law. We have to understand why that law is actually good for individual people living their lives, or else we wouldn't consider it impact. So if that's the mission-driven outcomes, the next question is attributable. So next point is attributable. So this is a point that a lot of ink has spilled over in the sector, the question of how can we prove that a program is having an effect. We can leave aside the kind of methodological questions for a moment, but the basic concept is kind of irrefutable. Like you can't call your impact if you didn't cause it, just because you are parallel to it or around it. We need, we call our own impact the things that we cause in the world. And then the final part, and easily the most controversial part of our definition is, hold on. Is this relative to resources piece. We see that it's not enough to just look at outcomes. We have to look at what we spend to achieve those outcomes, because the reality is that we live in a world which is resource constrained. It shouldn't be resource constrained, or it should be a lot less resource constrained in the nonprofit sector, but it is. And so when we spend a dollar someplace, that means we're not spending a dollar someplace else. And we owe it to the people we are trying to help to spend that dollar effectively. And this is a simple example. You look at two nonprofits, they're both spending the same amount of money. One saves a life for one life. One saves a life for 2,000 lives. This is Living Goods. This is what they do. They save a life for about $5,000, the life of a child under 5. Which would we, conclude as more impactful? I think we would conclude that Living Goods is more impactful. The way that we compare between different programs, or one method, is cost effectiveness. And cost effectiveness is just saying, let's take the impact of a program and let's compare it to some benchmark. And maybe that could be a benchmark of another program, or maybe it could be something else out there in the world. So we often get into a case here where there's a lot of skepticism of cost effectiveness. And I think that, I think I find it very important to try and turn the tables on that skepticism a little bit. The reality is that we are intervening in people's lives. Every nonprofit is intervening in the lives of others. That's almost a definitional aspect of a nonprofit. And as a result, we're constantly experimenting on people. Even if we don't acknowledge it ourselves, even if we don't call it an experiment, we're constantly saying, we think that this mentorship program is good enough that we can ask students to stay after school a couple days a week for 2 or 3 years to try and graduate high school. Or we think that this asset savings program that's going to squirrel away somebody's money on their behalf with like very little kind of using all the behavioral nudges that we know work out there is worth it because savings are good or something like that. Like we're constantly as nonprofits experimenting on people based on our own hypotheses about how the world works. And just because we don't call it an experiment, just because we don't have a control group, doesn't mean it's not an experiment. And so to me, that gives us a fundamental duty of care, right? Like the people we are intervening on we owe them a duty of care. Now, we don't have a professional obligation to that. There's no, Society of Nonprofit Professionals that says, as a nonprofit executive, you have a duty to care for the people you serve. So it's not defined in any kind of legal or quasi-legal sense. But nevertheless, we are asking people to trust us with making changes to our lives. And therefore, the conclusion that I reach is that rigorously evaluating our work to prove that we actually deserve that trust, to prove that we are actually there to improve their lives is, it has to be the starting point of our work. And of course, the doctors have, and health workers put it the most concisely, do no harm, right? As a doctor, that is your fundamental your fundamental starting point. And that's why you see the medical profession such a body of evidence around what works and what doesn't work. Because if you start with the concept of do no harm, then everything that you do to intervene on somebody's life, you have to justify that it's actually not only not doing harm, but that it's achieving something good. Because doing something that's useless for somebody is also doing harm, because you're taking their time, you're taking resources, and so forth. So that's one way of sort of justifying looking at cost effectiveness. The other is just like pick your dogmatist, who's sort of, who you think has the best view on the world, and they pretty much all say the same thing. We shouldn't have a world where people are suffering in extreme poverty, if that is our imperative to eliminate extreme poverty, to eliminate suffering, to eliminate oppression, then it's imperative that we don't waste time doing that. And the truth of the matter is, when we invest in programs that don't work, we are wasting time. We are wasting time to solve that problem. I mean, this is one illustrative example. Both of these are real nonprofits, although I didn't put the name of the second one. But TechnoServe's a nonprofit we did quite a bit of analysis on. Some of their programs are creating $30 in additional income for every dollar they spend. That's not a typo. Like, they're incredibly effective because they're basically intervening in places where there's a complete market failure. There's no market for capital, for lending, for smallholder farmers in rural areas in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And so they can't get loans, they can't invest in their fields and their crops. And so as a result, an organization comes in, makes either loans or grants at that level, is willing to pay the servicing costs essentially of doing that, and you can see enormous returns. Nonprofit B also works in a similar situation, and similar context, somewhat more urban, but similar levels of poverty and geography. And as you can see, they're creating about 60 cents in additional income per dollar spent. Now, if the option was to do nothing or to give people who are poor 60 cents, we should give people who are poor 60 cents, no questions asked. So nonprofit B is not bad per se, but TechnoServe is much better. And so if we're able to redirect resources where they're going to go further, we're going to get towards the end of this sort of long process of eliminating extreme poverty, extreme suffering in our world. All right. So that's the kind of the setup, a fairly long setup. But now we get to the question of like, okay, so if we refuted the waste myth, what about the effectiveness myth? Because people were saying not just, you waste money on CEO salaries, but actually you're not achieving anything, right? You're not achieving your intentions. And what do we actually see when we look at the data? So at Impact Matters over the last 5 or 6 years, we were, as Andrew mentioned, we were acquired by Charity Navigator last year. And so for the 5 or 6 years before that, we looked at just over 1,000 direct service programs. And these spanned a pretty wide array of different types. So we looked at school improvement, community health, workforce development, homelessness, food distribution, cataract surgery, water, scholarship programs, tree planting, the list goes on. So we got a pretty good cross section, again, looking just at direct service programs. We compared like to like, so we didn't compare soup kitchens to water programs. We compared soup kitchens to soup kitchens. Programs that were achieving the same outcome. We looked at those in comparison. And of course, we actually looked at impact. So We looked at what are the outcomes that are attributable to those organizations' work, and how does that compare to the costs that those organizations were spending. Let's keep on skipping. This is freezing. There we go. Okay. So this was our big finding. 86% of nonprofits are cost effective. And that's not, only 15% of nonprofits that we looked at could even be considered ineffective. Of the 86%, most of those we actually put into the highly cost effective bucket. We basically bucketed the world in three ways. We said ineffective, cost effective, and highly cost effective. And 86% were cost effective, 56% or 54%, something like that, were highly cost effective. Here are some examples of some really kind of exceptional groups. Eden reforestation projects, they plant a tree for about 10 cents. And so for about $7, they can offset the average American's carbon footprint. Sankara is preventing blindness for $70. Living Goods is saving the life of a child, as I mentioned, for about $5,000. Nourish Pierce County is feeding somebody for about 40 cents. So these are some extreme examples of effectiveness, but again, based on our criteria, almost everybody counted as cost effective. I'll talk in a second a little bit about our methodology, but before I get to that, let me just highlight some of the critical kind of the key examples of how we could be wrong. So these are some critiques, and I'm happy to, if there are questions, this is probably a good place to dive in. One critique is that we looked only at direct service. This is absolutely true. And the reason is just that advocacy is much more difficult to analyze the impact of, not that it doesn't potentially have significant impact, just that it's more difficult to understand. That being said, our estimates do cover 15 billion in annual spending, so they're not a trivial portion of the sector. Many of the areas we looked at almost all the programs, so there may be some selection effects that we see in our numbers, but the selection effects are not going to be great for at least some of the areas where we found groups were overwhelmingly cost effective. It's true that a lot of our interventions are on the easier side to implement, but our philosophy is that the complexity intervention is not what matters here. What matters is the outcome. And so if you can achieve that outcome easily, why not achieve it easily? We don't see any inherent virtue in complexity. And then finally, there's the open question of is our analysis good enough? And this isn't a reasonable question. Cost effectiveness analysis is never precise. It's always kind of a mix of hard data and assumptions. There's actually literally no way to do an accurate cost effectiveness analysis, a completely accurate one, because we'd have to observe the world in which the program happened and the world in which it didn't. And obviously we only see one of those worlds. But I think the key point here is, in order for a conclusion that nonprofits are largely effective to be wrong, in other words, for the truth to be that most nonprofits are not effective, we would have to be extremely off on our numbers. So it wasn't just that these groups were past the bar for high cost effectiveness. Many of them passed the bar with flying colors. So one example is, if we go back to Sankara, the benchmark we set, I can't remember the exact one for India, but it's something like it would be cost effective to prevent a case of blindness if Sankara was spending $50,000 to avert one case of blindness through cataract surgeries. So they're not a factor of 10, they're not even a factor of 100, they're a factor of close to 1,000 more cost effective than the bar that we set based on what the WHO says is a cost effective health program. So again, they're an outlier. I mean, they're one of the best, but all of the cataract surgery programs we looked at were somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 to avert blindness or less. We would have to be extremely off in our numbers for our basic conclusion to be wrong. Okay. So let me stop here. I'm going to answer Brittany's question, which is like, how do we actually measure impact? I've done this, I've practiced this once, so forgive me if it goes a little off. But what we're going to try and do is basically do a cost effectiveness analysis right now. And it should only take like 5 or 10 minutes. We'll see. So we're going to set up a new spreadsheet. And let's see. So typically how we do like rough, we have this very complex spreadsheet, which I'll show you guys. But typically how we do how we do these are in these sort of 4 columns. So we have like a label, a value, notes, and a source are the four columns that we use here. And so we're going to do a water purification intervention, and I want it to be comparable to the Trade Navigator data. So we're going to do a couple of years ago. So that's to be. So the first thing that we care about with water purification is the type of filter. And if we go to the World Water Project's 2017-990, they don't even have a website, but we can see in their description of their program that they use something called in-home biosand water filters. That might not be that readable, but and we could also see from the same source that in that year they distributed 3,240. So now we have to understand, okay, so of the 3,240 water filters, what is that actually doing to actually lead to clean water? And the metric that we care about is clean water, a person year of clean water. And so we're going to use 4 different pieces to get to that. So we're going to look at, of those 3,200 filters, how many were taken up, how many people are served by each purifier, and what is the efficacy rate? So how effective are those purifiers at cleaning water, and how long are each purifier in use? So we can use numbers that Impact Matters put together on this. So we have water purification uptake is 88%. The efficacy rate is 92%. We observed their use was 5%. So these are all from IM assumptions. And then we actually had the average number of people served was something that World Water Project reported here, because they said, 3,200 filters are serving about 32,000 people. So we can say 10 is the number there. So what we're able to do with that is we're able to say that each filter is serving about 40 people. Each filter is creating 40 person years of water. Right. And so, we can then get the total person years provided for that year of program work. And that's going to be just 3,200 times 40. So those are our trivial outcomes right there. 130,000 person years of clean water being provided. We look at our counterfactual, and the counterfactual is going to be how many people would have gained water. And we don't have a great estimate directly for them, but we can very easily use an estimate from that we can get from from survey data. So we know that in Uganda, the average change in safely managed drinking water is about 0.3% or 0.1%, excuse me. So it's a very slow increase that we're seeing in how many people have access to water. And so that's going to give us our attributable outcomes, and that's going to be times this 1 minus that. Right? So it's almost exactly the same, because again, we expect very few of these people to have access to clean water. And then the final piece of data that we need is cost. So look at program costs. Again, we can go right to the 990, and we can see up here, this is their water filter program, costs $480,322. Now at Impact Matters, we do like a lot of additional adjustments, but it would be basically the same number at the end. And so from that, we can get to impact. So all that impact is at this moment, the cost per impact or cost per outcome is 480,000 divided 130,000, $4. And if we go to World Water Project and we look at what we came up with, you can see here it's basically the same. Roughly $4 of clean water per person, roughly $4 to provide a year of clean water to a person. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I'm going to end about here. But the basic point I want to make with this is, there's this mysticism around what is cost effectiveness, what is impact analysis. Fundamentally, it's a pretty easy type of analysis. We're basically looking at what did we achieve, how much did it cost to achieve it, and then dividing the two. And if we do this for a lot of nonprofits, what we see again is that most are very effective. And I take heart in that, and that if the sector at the moment is improving a lot of lives, and the more money we can get to the sector, the more lives we're going to improve. All right, I'm going to stop there.
Elijah, thank you so much. Really appreciate your perspectives on cost effectiveness and the effectiveness of charities in general. We had a couple other questions, but we'll address those. We'll find a way to connect y'all and address those offline. But Elijah, thank you so much for sharing kind of your work with us today and all the stuff that you've done with Charity Navigator and Impact Matters, and then the work now that you're doing with Spiral. So thanks so much for
having me. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
Awesome.